Good evening. Thank you, Matthew. That was exceedingly kind. And thank you, Susan, for inviting me to be here tonight. It gives me special pleasure to be here and to have been asked to deliver this 2020 Kesterton Lecture. When Matthew and I were talking a few weeks ago, he asked me if I had ever attended a Kesterton. And I told him I'd had the privilege of attending the Kesterton Lectures as one of his students. Matthew actually said, wow. I did sit in Wilf Kesterton's lecture hall as he taught journalism and the law. It was a great class, and Wilf covered everything. I loved Wilf. Libel, plagiarism, copyright. His most popular lecture, though, which was a true tour de force, was on obscenity. It was a campus highlight. Back in the day, for that one class, we moved into a larger room, and that room was packed. Most of the engineering school attended. I think they were trying to improve their vocabulary. In the more than 40 years since I left Carleton, much, of course, has changed. We're meeting in this wonderful new, at least to me, building with great and committed leadership and teaching skill. And of course, those of you who are students now are facing a more complex and dynamic media environment than my fellow students and I faced or even imagined all those years ago. Seriously, the lack of internet, cell phones, personal computers, 24-hour media and news cycles may put me back in the era of hot type and manual typewriters, which, believe me, it does. But in this J school, I found a path. When it finally dawned on me that my math and science skills, especially the math, were not going to be up to realizing my dream of female Jacques Cousteau marine biologist, I turned my thoughts to journalism, and more specifically, the foreign correspondent. I had before me almost every night on the CBC the example of Joe Schlesinger, and as extravagantly accented as Jacques Cousteau, Czech in the case of Joe, wearing a white trench coat with a trenchant summing up of the day's events. From Vienna, Paris, Washington, I followed all of Joe's reporting. I was not to know that when I became a foreign correspondent, just as the Cold War ended in the late 1980s and the walls came crashing down, that those events would unleash the demons that have come to plague us in the 30 years since. And far from that chic, white, globe-trotting trench coat I envisaged, most of my foreign corresponding involved a sturdy pair of boots, a 10-plus kilo flak jacket permanently parked in my London front hall, an extremely unflattering helmet, and most often an armored car, and usually a lack of water, accommodation, electricity, occasionally food, sometimes accompanied by deadly diseases. The phone ringing in the middle of the night. Up, packed, and gone by dawn. The first time I went to Sarajevo was in June 1992, about 2 months after the Civil War started. Let me set the scene a little. This is a conflict in the heart of Europe, not some distant, faraway affair, but a 2-hour flight from my home in London. And in a sense, this was a struggle for the very nature of Europe. Following the collapse of the Soviet Union, ethnic tensions exacerbated by criminal gangs came to a boil in the Balkans, and the former Yugoslavia began to violently fall apart. The result was a terrible internecine civil war where ethnic and religious divisions became everything and pitted Catholic Croats against Orthodox Serbs against Muslim Bosniaks, all driven by criminals desperate to maintain the status quo and power. The Humanitarian Law Center now estimates at least 130,000 people were killed, and that conflict brought the first war crimes charges, including for genocide, in Europe since World War II. In the summer of 1992, and until the war ended in 1995, Sarajevo was a city under siege. The Serbs and their guns controlled the high hills and the routes in and out. Sitting in the valley, Sarajevo and its people were sitting ducks. A trip to get bread or water or to go to school could very easily end in death, and for 12,000 of the city's inhabitants it did. Although this was the city that had welcomed the world to the Olympic Winter Games in 1984, just 8 years later, regular air service was suspended, and Sarajevo was a city cut off and besieged. And that June, the international community decided a corridor had to be opened, a panacea of sorts that did not stop the worst of what was to come, more of a kind of cold compress on the disturbed foreheads of pressured international leaders determined to do only the minimum necessary. And I don't mean that by that to criticize the men and women in uniform from various countries who served their countries and did what was ordered of them. So the first time I flew to Sarajevo, I was in a C-130 of the Norwegian Air Force. A C-130 Hercules is the workhorse of armed forces around the world, including Canada, basically a very simple four-propeller, huge load carrier. This flight for the Norwegians was so prestigious, not because me and my crew were on it, but because they, with the supplies they were carrying, were going to break the siege of Sarajevo. And the entire crew, from pilot to loadmaster, were the most senior available. In order to get to Sarajevo Airport and its runways, we had to overfly airspace controlled by Serb anti-aircraft guns. And so when we began our descent, it was not some lazy loop. Instead, we corkscrewed down, turning in fast, tight circles over the grounds, the airport proper. Out the landing platform at the rear, engines never cutting, instructed to run, not as easy as it sounds in a flak jacket, and lugging gear. Planes still moving, angling back to take off. And then, my first drive into town. It was a soft skin. To you and me, a regular van. Soft because its shell offered no protection against guns of any type, let alone high-velocity sniper's weapons. Loaded up, driver in full recline position, so his head would have the quote-unquote protection of the post between the front and the back seats, rolling out full blast. We had one Serb checkpoint to clear and then floor it down Sniper's Alley. 3 kilometers, a very long 3 kilometers, in full view of the Serb gunners in the hills. Hit the checkpoint, throw some cash around, hang a hard right, and then as fast as we could go. Made it past the Olympic suburb, past the post office. And then it became clear that afternoon we could go no further. There was too much incoming. We ended up in the television building, which was a brutalist concrete structure, thank God, built for the Olympics. And somehow we managed to file the story of that journey and whom we had met. I slept that night on the floor in a flak jacket, under a desk, in a corridor next to an interior courtyard, waking to the grinding of tank treads somewhere close. That was not the last night I slept in a flak jacket. We eventually stayed in the Sarajevo Holiday Inn, one of just a handful of hotels in the world to acquire iconic war zone status, stacked top to bottom with hacks of all nationalities sitting right on the front line. At the Holiday Inn, the preference was for a room where the window had already been shot out and replaced with UN plastic sheeting. Yes, that meant that the Serbs could strike again, and you froze in winter, but you wouldn't be dealing with glass shrapnel. You wanted a room no higher than the 5th floor, and best of all, a bathtub already full of water, not for bathing, but to keep the rest of the plumbing functioning. There was no expectation of electricity. In my time in Sarajevo and all the Balkans wars, which continued until June of 1999, and in all the other wars and disasters I covered throughout my career, I was acutely aware I had enormous privilege. I had a passport. I was not trapped. I had a way out, though sometimes that was complicated. And whatever I saw or witnessed, whatever horror or trauma I carried with me, that was very little compared to the people who were living through the most terrible points in their lives. They suffered far more than any interloping journalist who had signed up to be there. I'd like you all to remember that as we talk about this. For the most part, we're witnessing, not living it. I may be slipping in the blood on the hospital floor, but it's not the life of my child that's draining away. For journalists of my generation who were covering conflict, and in those years there was a lot of it, the International Committee of the Red Cross counted 56 wars with more than 17 million people made refugees. We were a pretty small multinational clan rolling from war to disaster and back. It was also intensely competitive, with the overarching demand to, quote, get the story. You weren't going to get fired for chartering a Learjet, but you were toast if you didn't come back with the goods. I had covered conflict before the Balkans, in Central America and the Middle East, but Sarajevo was the first war where I wore a flak jacket. We had flak jackets because we were targets, taking the same risks as the civilian population. In the middle of a hot war where the giant letters T and V in duct tape across a windshield offered no protection. Within months, because I worked for a network that had resources, we were driving armored cars, a luxury most freelancers and God knows civilians did not have. That decade brought real change in the way major news organizations conducted and continued to conduct business in most conflict zones. Flak jackets, armored vehicles, battlefield first aid training taught by ex-British Special Forces medics, which later morphed into week-long intensive instruction in hostile environments, ambushes, minefields, kidnapping, hostage-taking, and eventually, even how to use chemical and biological weapons survival gear and antidotes. We began using security advisors, all ex-Special Forces, and eventually the risk became so great that news organizations authorized those security advisors to carry weapons and to use them. Some organizations extended all this training, equipment, and protection to freelancers, like the freelance photographers who have always provided some of the most iconic images. Others did not. I am clear-eyed and indeed cynical enough to understand the reason why most news organizations were taking on these new costs, and that was liability. Journalists' death tolls were rising, and organizations which were outside new best practices faced the prospect of huge lawsuits in the event of death or injury. What news organizations did not do, for the most part, was address the psychological challenges of covering these events, and indeed ignored them. That is a cone of silence a former New York Times reporter, Chris Hedges, who has had his own battles, has called the callousness and cruelty of news organizations, feeding on a news culture that does not take care of its own. Some things have now changed, but not nearly enough, and we'll talk more about that later. The Balkans were bad, and for some of my colleagues produced lasting moments of trauma, for me too. But for many of us, what was most apocalyptically horrific was the genocide of Rwanda. Rwanda is a small Central African nation divided into two ethnic groups, the Hutu, who were then in power, and the Tutsis, who've been waging a largely unreported guerrilla war for years. And then something changed. As my friend, the writer Philip Gurevich, wrote about the summer of 1994, quote, all across Rwanda, murder, 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 murder. In 100 days, 800,000 people were killed. François Mitterrand, then president of France, dismissed this genocide as, quote, just what Africans do to each other. And that's not true. This was planned. It was deliberate, carefully plotted by the government of the day. Hutus, incited as if in a fever dream, picked up machetes and hacked their neighbors to death, the most intimate kind of slaughter imaginable. People they had worked with, shopped with, in some cases even married, men, women, children, babies. Halfway through a government-controlled radio station, the announcers, sensing growing fatigue with murder and blood and death, urged the killers on, saying, quote, the graves are only half full. The Tutsi army advanced, and as they did, the Hutu killers, mixed with civilians and Tutsi survivors, were pushed out towards the neighboring Democratic Republic of Congo. This, for me, in the words of a family member, is where my body count began to get, as I was told, a little high. For years, I could not talk about this, and still now have great difficulty. It's not exactly dinner party conversation. Some pictures I still see in my mind. A tiny girl, less than 2 years old, dropped at a dock on Lake Kivu by fleeing Tutsis in a canoe who had found her on the road alone, not old enough to say her name or where she had come from. I still wonder what happened to that child. In the unforgiving lava fields of Goma in the Congo at the border of Rwanda, not only were we surrounded by thousands of genocidal killers, but there was cholera, and cholera kills. The dying and the dead were everywhere, stacked like cordwood, piled sometimes above my head. Children alone crying. It felt almost biblical. We got what sleep we could on the ground in tents, and at night, when the generators that powered our equipment turned off, all you could hear was wailing. Rwandan schoolboys, brothers, still in their elementary school uniforms of tan shorts and yellow shirts, Tutsis, desperate to stay out of the camps the UN was trying to herd them into, because then they would be with the Hutu killers who had murdered their parents and snatched their baby sister from the eldest one's arms as they ran for their lives. I found those boys again later. Bodies on the beach, bodies by the side of the road, a spray of blood up the wall of a room, skeletons, skulls, me lying face down in an open field wearing a flak jacket between the border of Rwanda and Congo, caught in a fierce crossfire as bullets zipped, thinking only, if there are snakes here, I'm going to have to get up and run. A child, shocked into silence, maybe 10 or 11 years old, spattered with blood, being treated for a wound where the bullet that killed the baby's sister she'd been carried on her back grazed her. It adds up. As my colleague from the BBC, Fergal Keane, said when speaking about his own PTSD diagnosis, these things leave their mark. In the words of another colleague, quote, "Do not delude yourself into thinking that you can swan in and out of other people's wars year after year and not be affected by it." As I said before, what I hope you remember is that whatever it is that I am carrying or some of my colleagues are carrying, it is nothing compared to the people whose lives we witnessed and stories we were both privileged and compelled to tell. And why I'm talking about all this now is that we do not do enough talking about mental health of all kinds, and we do not talk enough about the need to speak more openly about mental health. That includes, but is not limited to, newsrooms or to journalism schools. So PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. This formal diagnosis first appeared in 1980 in the revised classifications of the American Psychiatric Association. It's not new. In World War I, it was called shell shock, and many of those completely traumatized who fled the front lines were executed for desertion. What is new is a better understanding of how trauma impacts the human psyche. We now have a much better idea how those who serve in the military, police, and other first responders might be affected. But you do not have to go to a war zone to be affected. There are many different kinds of war zones, and most do not involve war. An ER nurse, a survivor of childhood abuse or bullying, an abusive relationship or marriage. You can be a journalist covering a pileup on a snowy highway, covering the evacuation of a community faced with an out-of-control wildfire confronting the deaths of neighbors, a domestic terror attack, an editor at home base who in this age faces a fire hose of images coming at them over and over. You can experience something traumatic, think that you are fine and that it is dealt with, and then years later be triggered by some other life event. Very briefly, as for all illnesses, there is a set of diagnostic criteria. In this case, responses to actual injury or threatened death or injury. By injury, we mean physical injury or emotional or psychological trauma. And the response must involve fear, helplessness, or horror. There are three further categories: intrusion or flashbacks, avoidance, persistent efforts to avoid anything that brings back memories of the event, and what is called arousal, and that's hypervigilance, problems with sleep, an exaggerated startle response. That's the PTSD triad. Severity varies. I know and have reported on combat vets so debilitated with PTSD they are virtually unable to function, to work, to enjoy family life in any setting. I have colleagues who have been hospitalized on and off for years after the event. I debated talking specifically about my own PTSD. As journalists, we're all trained that we're not the story. But I think that this is a forum in which to speak openly. And if I'm advocating for greater openness, it in fact becomes necessary. Over time, I became increasingly anxious and at times depressed. I was haunted by recurring nightmares, which often meant I could not sleep without medication. I could not and still cannot stand to watch violence on TV or films. I became a very nervous flyer. not helpful in someone whose number one job requirement is the ability to get on a plane. And that fear is a direct result of where many planes took me. My husband Bruno will tell you that to this day, his hands suffer in my grip on takeoff and landing, and let's not even talk about turbulence. My startled response was through the roof. I'm still not really comfortable with fireworks displays. I hate anything that sounds like gunfire. I spent a lot of time on high alert, and that's something I still deal with today. I've been treated with medication, talk therapy, and something called rapid eye movement desensitization, basically replaying events over and over until they lose the power to impact. And for me, it's been moderately successful. Time and distance have also helped. We owe almost everything we understand about PTSD in journalists thanks to the work of Dr. Anthony Feinstein. Dr. Feinstein is a Toronto-based neuropsychiatrist. In the 1990s, a patient was sent to him, a woman and a war correspondent, after she had severe physical symptoms which suggested she had had a stroke. But extensive testing showed no physical abnormality. Instead, Dr. Feinstein discovered she had all the symptoms of PTSD, which led him to explore the literature, where he found exactly nothing, not a single paper. Feinstein writes, in the same way that news organizations neglected to provide for the psychological welfare of their staff, trauma researchers ignored them too. Now, part of that is down to us, and by us, I mean our community. There is the basic difficulty of talking openly about mental health. Within news organizations, there is the perceived stigma of not being, quote, tough enough, of not being able to hack it. There is stigma around acknowledging or admitting fear, a sign of weakness. There is a perception of what a foreign correspondent or a war correspondent should be like. And then there's management. The fear of being rated as subpar and not fit for purpose and losing one's job is very real. I know several people that happened to, including two who had been seriously wounded on assignment. Even today, many news managers do not take seriously their responsibility for their employees' mental well-being. War zone assignments are supposed to be voluntary, but see what happens to your career when you turn them down. When I had to tell my foreign editor at CBS News that I could not face going back to Baghdad in 2006, after an assignment I organized in 2004 directly led to the murders of two colleagues and the wounding of a third by Sunni gunmen, I was both in the throes of full-blown PTSD and terrified I would lose my job. I was fortunate that that did not happen. The leadership of CBS News at that time was understanding. However, management changed a short while later, and I was punished. So back to the research. What Dr. Feinstein found after quizzing and examining dozens of journalists who covered war, and I was part of that initial study, with a control group of similar size of domestic journalists, is that 29% of the war correspondent group had PTSD, which is far greater than the 5% found in the general population, and runs at about the level found in combat veterans. The good news here is that 71% of the war group did not have PTSD, though some did show some signs of trauma. And in the domestic group pre-9/11, none were diagnosed with PTSD, again, though some did show some signs of trauma. Something else important in Dr. Feinstein's work, stills photographers and camera persons had the most extreme symptoms, followed by reporters and producers. He quoted famed war photographer Robert Capa's adage as explanation: if your pictures aren't good enough, you're not close enough. Almost all of those who had sought help had done so individually, with most unwilling or unable to tell their employers. Feinstein continued his work, focusing more intensively on domestic journalists and newsroom workers. And as the years passed, the data shifted as the world, the global security scene, has also shifted. A 2015 study by Eyewitness Media Hub surveyed news staff around the world and concluded office-bound staff who used to be somewhat shielded from viewing atrocities are now bombarded day in and day out with horrifically graphic material that explodes onto their desktops in volumes and at a frequency that is often very far in excess of the horrors witnessed by staff who are investigating or reporting from the front line. And in 2018, Anthony Feinstein conducted a retrospective study of PTSD data collected over 18 years from journalists who covered everything from 9/11, the Arab Spring, the longest wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, Mexican drug wars, and the refugee crisis in Europe. He found that the majority of those studied did not display symptoms of PTSD at any one moment in time. But over a longer time period, say 10 years, the data showed that rates of full-on PTSD still approach that of combat vets, around 29 to 30%, and that news organizations, while some had made progress, were, in his words, still far too complacent when it came to duty of care. That's in 2018. That's more than 20 years after his first landmark study. There are changes in the domestic landscape which are adding to the pressures and stress faced by domestic journalists and newsrooms. We've all heard fake news, enemy of the people, over and over and over again. Words can hurt, and these are words that resonate, that confirm in some dark corner of some souls what they have always known, that the game is rigged, that they are being lied to, and only if the story were told another way, life would be better. The result? Press pens at campaign events where reporters and crews are heckled, booed, and physically intimidated, now requiring physical protection. The swamp that is social media, which most employers now require journalists to engage with and measure their impact and by inference their value by the number of followers, where vitriol, hatred, threats, including death threats, are regular occurrences. None of that is good for anybody's well-being. Because of this shifting landscape, the kind of hazardous environment training that was offered to foreign correspondents is increasingly being taught to domestic journalists. Again, that's a liability issue. My own daughter, who is a senior reporter for Vice News based in New York and who reports on nationalism, extremism, policing, and guns, now wears a stab vest, a Kevlar vest, on about 50% plus of her field assignments in the US, and is assigned a security advisor, AKA a bodyguard, again about 50% of the time. There's doxing, a favorite tactic of the far right, but also used by other groups. A group angered by a story will target a reporter. The story can be anything from the doings at a school board meeting to an investigation. The group does a deep dive online and finds everything they can about that reporter. This is a reminder to everyone in this room to lock your profiles down as far as you can. Doxers will go to extraordinary lengths. In one case I know, the reporter's home address was found through voter registration rolls. His family members were identified. On a day when he and his wife were separately on 2 different long-haul flights and not contactable for hours, someone, pretending to be a police officer, called his mother and told her her son was dead and that she needed to come and identify the body. The reporter and his wife had been repeatedly harassed at home, death threats, bomb threats, swatting, where police are summoned with fake reports of someone with a weapon, a practice which has resulted in people being killed. They've moved 3 times in 18 months and are no longer registered to vote. Both the reporter and his wife are in treatment for stress-related trauma, and the police, who are paying attention, have not yet identified the members of the group responsible. All of this is to say we are working in increasingly complex environments, domestically and overseas, with greater stress, greater pressure, and the prospect for greater trauma. And that leads to a growing need for mental health awareness and care. This calls on us to do 3 things. The first is what we can do for ourselves. Be aware. Take your own mental health temperature. If you need help, do not be afraid to seek it. It is not weakness to acknowledge you need another tool in your toolbox. We need to work with employers to build on the work of those who have pioneered mental health care in journalism workplaces, and to find a way for people to feel safe and secure in coming forward. We need to include freelancers and local hires, and that includes drivers and translators who too often are left out of the equation. We need more capacity and resources. And we need to open up and to change the conversation, to have honest dialogue, and to have newsroom and academic leadership that can and will, with consistency, lead that conversation. To finally be able to speak about this without fear of stigma or shame. Thank you.